Good morning, everyone. It's Sunday, July 21st. I'm Mark Dent, and you're listening to the Hustle Daily Show's Weekend Edition. Over the last few decades, major corporations looking to save money and drive growth have gone to one go-to strategy: outsourcing labor. There are factories in Mexico and China and call centers in India where workers generate leads and act as customer service reps for companies in America. But there's also another type of outsourcing that's picked up in the last few years: outsourcing by regular workers. They've been driving a new mini economy of shadow stand-ins, where people take over other people's roles without their bosses knowing it. I learned about all this from an investigative story by Rob Price at Business Insider. Rob is a senior correspondent for Business Insider who focuses on investigations and long-form journalism. And as I mentioned, he wrote a great in-depth story about these shadow stand-ins. Rob, thanks for joining us today at the Hustle Daily Show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, okay. So Rob, there's been a lot of new employment trends that have arisen since the pandemic. I think everyone's familiar with quiet quitting. We've heard about people who work multiple jobs at once because they can kind of handle it without having to go into a brick and mortar office. But I feel like you have sort of broken ground on a relatively new phenomenon of shadow stand-ins. Can you tell us a little bit exactly about what this is and how you came to investigate this phenomenon?
Sure. So a shadow stand-in is, as you say, it's at its simplest, someone you hire secretly to do part or all of your job for you. And you're absolutely right that this has picked up markedly in the last few years. It predates the pandemic. There was a notorious case, I think, back in 2013 when an engineer at Verizon was caught outsourcing his job to someone in China. So he could just, I think they said, spend his days browsing Reddit and watching cat videos. And it was like a minor media sensation when that was found. Mm-hmm. But it's really the shift to remote work which really accelerated this. Obviously, it's an incredibly liberatory movement in terms of freeing people up from commute, large parts of daily grind, but it did open up some significant opportunities for the unscrupulous. And I first heard about this because for the last few years, I've been writing about various kinds of unusual professional misconduct. A little better known example is bait and switch job interviews, interview proxies, where you hire someone to help you with your job interview. Whether that's, wearing headphones and feeding you answers to an interview, or even lip syncing or taking the entire interview in your stead. There's also been the phenomenon of exam dumps, which is where people share the answers to tech exams, tech qualifications to help cheat your way through them. And it's through my reporting on some of these other flavors of professional misconduct that I started to end up in some of these groups dedicated to shadow stand-ins.
And this kind of just seems like it's the ultimate version of that. Instead of just having someone help you out with a job interview, or as we've all been aware of, colleges and fake essays and things like that have been going on for a long time. This just seems like it's the end stage, like the next level.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's important to know there's no one model for how this works. There are times when you have someone who might just help you with your assignment. You're swamped, it's a one-time thing, you ask someone for help. There's a designer I talked to from the Southwest US who, sometimes when he's swamped, he'll go on Fiverr and he'll hire two people to do sort of the work which he's been assigned for cheap from overseas, and he'll just pick the better one. But then the spectrum goes through to, someone who can hire, spend a few hours a day with you on basically using teleconferencing and screen sharing software to watch what you're working, give you tips, kind of like a black market IT help desk.
Yeah.
And then the other extreme of it is when you just literally give your shadow stand-in your login credentials so they can log into Slack, log into your workspace, and pretend to be 99% of your job.
And so how are people who try to find these shadow stand-ins, how do they find them? It's obviously a black market, or at least a gray market. So I assume you can't just type it into Google and find it, or maybe you can.
Well, increasingly you can. There's a term that lots of them use called job support, which I just love for how euphemistic it is. And if you go on Google and you search for job support, you will find a long list of firms that do this. But more broadly, I think, again, it's something where there's a spectrum. I talk to people who brought in friends, even brought in family members as shadow stand-ins when they were feeling desperate, through to people who get connected to others through word of mouth. And then you actually have these quasi-professional outfits who have websites, who advertise on Facebook and dedicated on Telegram, in dedicated groups with thousands of members. And they advertise, here are the list of skills and software platforms that we have competencies in. And here is a list of testimonials from previous happy customers.
Yeah, so it can be very organized. And I know you interviewed at least one of these job support groups because you even spoke with someone on the record who worked for one of them. Tell me a little bit more about what they do, because as he kind of tried to, I think, explain in your story, and I think the company again is called onlinejobsupport.net. And I mean, he kind of put it as like, well, we're just kind of doing a little bit of a service and helping people out when they need it. How do they kind of see what they're actually doing?
So certainly the way they brand themselves is they're helping people who don't have the skills. They're a crutch. It's unorthodox. It might not technically be allowed, but they're just trying to help someone get better at their job and get to the point where they don't need this job support, this shadow stand-in anymore. That's the way they very much telegraph it. And there's also an interplay between user shadow stand-ins and proxy interview services, like I mentioned. It's often the case that someone shoots the way for a job interview, they get hired, and then they go, oh, whoops, I don't actually have the technical skills to perform at this job I cheated my way into. And so then they'll bring on a shadow stand-in at least part-time to help until they get their feet under them. And yeah, I think that's very much how they frame themselves. Maybe it's not always that way in practice. And certainly there's other people I chatted to who have very different motivations for using this. But they argue, this is just another way to help desperate job seekers until they're ready to perform by themselves.
Yeah. And are there other reasons why people decided to do this? Why someone would desire to hire a stand-in? You mentioned, of course, maybe they just feel like they don't have the technical skills. You had an example of someone in your story who I think had just been inundated in her personal life and was just struggling to get all of her work done. What is it that workers get out of hiring a stand-in?
Yeah. So the reason they need it is super varied. As is sometimes it's, lack of technical qualification, as we discussed. Sometimes it's, you're feeling overwhelmed. I chatted to a guy who had tens of thousands of dollars in student loan debt, and he used it to help him get a second job without telling either job about the other one. And he views it as a means to an end to getting out of debt faster. And there's other people who are much more deliberate about the whole overemployment side of things, and it's purely a transactional thing. They don't think that they owe loyalty to their employer, and this is a way they can make money faster. And that's really all there is to it for them.
And I think you spoke to one person who lives in Southeast Asia. You identified him as Kevin, and he's a developer there. And I think that he maybe had 3 jobs. Is that right?
And yeah, Kevin was a really fascinating guy to chat to. So he, as I say, he's a developer. He has 3 jobs. None of the jobs know about the other ones. He has a separate shadow stand-in to help him with each job. So he'll sort of assign them specific concrete tasks. It's interesting because the measures he's taking to protect himself, his shadow stand-in don't actually know the extent of his setup. They don't even know the companies that he works for.
Wow.
He just gives them this very safe, neutral, packet of information, code something that does X with Y kind of thing. And he also lives in Southeast Asia. None of his 3 employers actually know that he's in Southeast Asia. They think he's based stateside, and he works US days, nights in Southeast Asia in order to avoid detection. And it's an incredibly financially motivated thing for him. He's paying very low cost of living and getting 3 well-paid US tech salaries to live on.
Yeah, I assume that for people who are listening to this, that, they're probably going to be in a couple of groups when they hear a story like that. There's going to be some people who are like, hell yeah, he's beating the system. There's going to be other people who are like, that guy's cheating, he's not being honest, etc. I wonder, for people who do this, what are their justifications and what are their ethical qualms, if any?
Yeah, so for people who are doing this a short-term thing, they will often justify it as, there's no harm, no foul here. I'm just doing it to get better. There's no malicious intent, so the company's not actually being harmed, and so nothing to see here, don't worry about it, not a big deal. For people like Kevin, it gets more interesting. There's a much more ideological underpinnings. Obviously, he's financially motivated to the extreme, but it's also like a very deliberate rejection of traditional American corporate norms and expectations. And obviously, I spoke to very much of the opinion that companies in our capitalist system are this fundamentally exploitative machine. They're there to make money off your labor and pay you less than the value of your labor. You don't owe them anything in these people's opinions. And therefore, if you found a way to hack the system and offload your labor and make a little profit yourself on that, then that's fair play. It's all's fair in love and war.
Yeah. I want to get to talking a little bit more about the corporation side of it here in a minute, but one more thing that you had in this article that I thought was really interesting was you talked to someone who'd been basically kind of recruited by a company that identified themselves as as a consulting firm. And this was over LinkedIn. And what it seemed like is it was maybe one of those kind of job support type of companies trying to recruit someone to apply for various jobs and then said, we'll do the work for you, or at least some of the work for you. What exactly was going on with that?
Yeah, that was a really fascinating one. And it was with a developer up in Oregon called Tim Woodruff. And he was super helpful with me on this story more broadly as well. He's kind of monitored this professional misconduct himself for years. And he got a message on LinkedIn from someone basically saying, hey, we're a recruiting consulting firm. If you let us apply for jobs on your behalf, you go do the job interviews. And then if Tim got the job, then they would do his work. And 95% of the work, he'd have to go to your meeting. And they would take a slice of his salary in return. And it was a very interesting dynamic. He noticed that they were applying for him and sending him to interviews with lots of big IT consultancies, some of which had government contracts, which actually had national security implications.
Wow.
Like there was one with the Secret Service, and there was another with the Department of Treasury, if I remember correctly. And I'm not suggesting that this was like a deliberate espionage template of that kind. Like there's no suggestion that this shadow stand-in firm knew who these contracts would be for, but it really gets at some of the risks inherent in this. That if Tim had been a legitimate customer and he had been accepted from these jobs and taken it, then there would have been unauthorized people on the networks potentially having access to really quite sensitive information.
And it's just incredible to me that one of these kind of shadow stand-in firms could go to the lengths of where they're recruiting people to apply for jobs and saying, we'll work for you. Yeah. I always envisioned this as more of a, an overwhelmed worker reaching out to like a stand-in firm. Yeah. It is just, truly wild to think that this could be happening.
Yeah, that's obviously a very organized one, and there's been smaller examples as well. I chatted with someone else she was a developer and she had an account on one of his freelance platforms, like freelance.com or Fiverr. And he periodically gets messages from people basically saying, hey, if you let me use your account, I will apply for other jobs on the platform on your behalf. I'll do all the work for this freelance job and I'll just give you a cut of it. The rationale there is that this work is often coming from emerging economies like India, where it's harder to get hired for this kind of work. And so, people are absolutely being pitched on this who might not have otherwise thought about it, both on an organized scale and by sort of individual actors like that as well.
Yeah. So to move on a little bit here to thinking about sort of the corporate side of this, one thing that I think was like a theme that really kind of stuck with me throughout the piece is you kind of brought this up a little bit, is people just talking about how this is just kind of part of capitalism, or taking it maybe to an even further extent than which these big companies are taking it to things like outsourcing, of course, that is. And I wonder, what do you think this reflects on the current state of work here in the US and frankly globally, if people can just outsource their work to some random person who they don't know, regardless of what their motive is, and that companies might not really notice it all that easily?
So I think a few things. I mean, firstly, there's clearly been this wave of alienation in professional life, which I think a lot of people have potentially felt like that historically, and it's only over the last 5, maybe 10 years that there has been a more sort of concerted, online-generated movement where people have been able to share skills and expertise, if that makes sense. I mean, you have things like overemployment, which is very much which is driven by the community sharing best practices, if you want to call them that. You have communities like anti-work on Reddit, which just creates this, so this groundswell of populist, anti-corporate opinion. And in terms of, for the companies themselves, it's very much like a cat and mouse thing, I think. We have built incredibly powerful new tools for the network and communicate around the world. And people are always going to try and take advantage of that. And I think, a lot of companies are, they're on the back foot at this point, and they're trying to catch up a little bit still.
And speaking of these powerful tools, one thing that I believe a source mentioned in your story is that to some degree, we have the same tools. You have these large companies, whether it's like Amazon Web Services or just a certain SaaS platform, that people have familiarity because a lot of companies are just running on the same thing. So it's not that hard necessarily to find somebody who could use the tools that you use at your job.
Yeah, absolutely. That's not the only driver, but it's one of the big drivers of this is that, shadow standards are particularly prevalent in the tech sector. And being an expert in ServiceNow or AWS, these are things that literally millions and millions of people all over the globe know how to use. They've got the qualifications to prove it. And, certain other jobs, working in policy, let's say, that's a very niche specialized skill set. Even someone like one state over might not be able to directly transfer to what you're doing. But if you're managing the ServiceNow instance for a big company, chances are for tens of thousands of other people who could do that job quite capably, even if they don't know the details of what your company does, because of how ubiquitous these tools have become. And that is a big part of what created this opening.
And I also wonder, again, this was another sort of message that I think maybe one of your sources brought up in the story was like that if there are thousands of people who could technically do this job, it just makes you kind of wonder, are companies doing enough work to try and, find all the right employees? If there's people who are trying to outsource it and then there are others who are good enough to do it, but maybe they don't have the same credential or maybe they live in a different country, it just kind of makes you wonder just how efficient companies are and how fair maybe our global economy is.
That's interesting. I mean, you can certainly make that case for, these companies need to be making more of an attempt to find the very best talent. But in practice, is that going to start the best talent? Or is that going to continue to be, companies relentlessly optimizing in favor of finding the cheapest talent, no matter where it is in the world?
Yeah.
And I think it's that impulse that a lot of companies have had is, this part of the justification that people have using shadow standards. But if companies are going to be, so mercenary with how they manage talent, then why shouldn't individual workers be as well?
Yeah. Okay. So final question is, you mentioned in this story that it's really impossible to tell exactly how many shadow stand-ins there are because it is, a gray market, obviously. But what sense do you have about the trends with shadow stand-ins? Are we going to see more of them in the future? Obviously, we have AI causing a lot of disruptions. People are still working from home, although maybe not as much as a couple of years ago. Where do you think this kind of trend goes?
I think the shadow stand-in initial boom is over. With the pandemic, was this huge explosion in popularity. And people have never heard of or done this before, kind of stumbled into it and started using it. Since then, things probably leveled off a little bit. I talked to a lot of providers who said that return to office mandates, it's got a little trickier. Like it absolutely still exists at scale. It's not going away, but you're not seeing the same kind of rapid growth that you might have, 2 or 3 years ago. To that end, I think it will continue to grow, at least to some capacity. As more and more people find out about it, it spreads through word of mouth. I can see that continue to go up. But at the same time, things like AI will, not for all jobs, but certainly for at least some, be able to fulfill a lot of the same functions. And I think people who maybe 4 years ago were looking on Facebook or Telegram to hire someone might realize that actually ChatGPT can approximate a pretty similar job.
Yeah. I mean, so AI, it just comes for everything, huh?
Yeah.
Basically. All right. Well, Rob, thank you again so much for joining us. Again, it's Rob Price from Business Insider, and he wrote the story, The Rise of Shadow Stand-ins, which we will have linked for you here on our page. And you can check out the rest of his work on Business Insider. And thank you again, everyone, for listening to us today on the Hustle Daily Show. We're a proud part of the HubSpot podcast network. Our editor today is Robert Hartwig, and our executive producer is Darren Clark. We have a lot more tech and business coverage in our newsletter, so please, if you're not subscribed, go get signed up at thehustle.co/email, and we'll catch you tomorrow.